The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military outpost, painting the world in shades of sand and heat shimmer. Private Daniel Cole, fresh from basic training and still carrying the awkward stiffness of a recruit, stood at the edge of the maintenance yard. His uniform was spotless, his boots polished, and his rifle slung neatly on his shoulder. Everything about him screamed new. In front of him, crouched over the hulking bulk of a decades-old tank, was someone who could not have looked more different. The man's back was bent, his hair more gray than black, and his hands greasy, scarred, and Steady moved with a confidence that seemed almost casual. The other mechanics in the yard gave him quiet respect. They carried wrenches, tools, and instructions. But it was he who set the rhythm of their work. Daniel squinted at the man. He had been told the old mechanic's name was Harris, just Harris. No rank, no title. On paper, he was a civilian contractor who helped keep the outpost's aging armored vehicles running. But there was something about him that unsettled Daniel. Harris moved around the tank like a surgeon in an operating room, diagnosing problems with a touch, tightening bolts with an instinct that came not from manuals but from memory. Daniel's curiosity overcame his nerves. "Sir," he stopped, realizing Harris was not technically a soldier. "Mr. Harris, how do you know where to start with something that complicated?" Harris glanced at him, eyes sharp under the brim of his sweat-stained cap. For a moment, Daniel thought the man would dismiss him. Instead, Harris gave a small grunt and nodded toward the open engine hatch. "You do not start anywhere, kid," Harris said. His voice was gravelly, yet it carried the weight of command. "You listen to the machine. It tells you what it needs. All you have to do is respect it. Enough to pay attention." Daniel leaned closer, watching as Harris twisted a wrench, wiped oil from a line, and checked pressure valves with nothing but his fingers. It was mesmerizing. Minutes stretched into hours, and Daniel forgot the heat. He forgot his own nervousness, lost in the rhythm of Harris's work. By the time the tank roared back to life, its engine growling with renewed strength, Daniel felt like he had witnessed something rare, something sacred. The other mechanics clapped Harris on the back. Daniel found himself blurting out the question that had been burning in his chest. "How do you know all this? You act like you have been around tanks your whole life." For a long moment, Harris was silent. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sand stretched endlessly, as if he were seeing a battlefield no one else could. His voice, when it came, was quieter. "I have," he said simply. "I used to command an armored division, long before." "You ever picked up that rifle?" Daniel froze. The words hit him harder than any drill sergeant's bark. He looked at Harris again, not as a tired old mechanic, but as something else entirely. A man who had once commanded hundreds of men and machines, who had written history in steel and fire, and who now bent quietly over a wrench as if that past had never existed. For the first time since joining the army, Daniel felt the true weight of what it meant to serve, not the polished ceremony, not the shouted commands, but the quiet endurance of men like Harris, who carried whole wars inside their silence. And he knew, deep down, that his own journey as a soldier had only just begun. The desert was relentless. It had a way of stripping everything down to essentials: sweat, dust, and the hard reality of survival. For Private Daniel Cole, who had only been stationed at the remote outpost for 2 weeks, The environment was both overwhelming and humbling. He was 20 years old, fresh from basic training, and eager to prove himself. His instructors had drilled him in marksmanship, discipline, and endurance. But nothing had prepared him for the monotony of the barren horizon or the sound of silence. Stretching endlessly between sand dunes, the outpost itself was a scattering of prefabricated buildings, tents, and a maintenance yard where the real backbone of the base, the armored vehicles, were kept alive. On Daniel's third day of guard duty near the motor pool, he noticed an unusual figure among the crew of younger mechanics. The man was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a wiry frame and a gait that suggested both weariness and strength. His hair, where it escaped from beneath a faded cap, was streaked with gray. His coveralls bore the stains of years of oil, grease, and dust. But what stood out most to Daniel was the way everyone deferred to him, not formally, not with salutes, but with quiet respect. When the younger mechanics hesitated over a task, he did not bark orders. Instead, he would kneel, run his calloused fingers across a pipe or panel, and then direct them with simple words. Within minutes, the problem would be solved. Daniel had grown up fascinated by machines, particularly tanks. His father, a factory worker back home, used to tell him that machines had personalities. "Treat them right, son, and they'll never fail you," he used to say. Watching the old mechanic now, Daniel thought his father would have approved of this man. It was later that same day when Daniel's curiosity pulled him closer. The sun was low, bleeding orange light across the sand, and the mechanics were crowded around an old M1 Abrams that had refused to start for days. The others scratched their heads, manuals in hand, but the older man, Harris, as Daniel had overheard, with steady assurance, he removed his gloves, placed a hand against the side of the tank as though listening to it breathe, then ducked inside the open hatch. Daniel lingered at the edge of the group, pretending to adjust his rifle sling, while stealing glances. Something about the scene felt almost ceremonial. The Abrams had been silent for 3 days, a useless hulk of steel. Harris muttered under his breath, probing here and there, tightening one bolt, loosening another. Daniel could see the younger mechanics watching with the same quiet awe he felt. Then, with a flick of a wrench and a sharp command to prime the fuel line, Harris straightened up. "Try it now." The starter groaned, then caught. A roar filled the yard, and the tank's engine thundered back to life, vibrating the ground beneath Daniel's boots. The men cheered, but Harris only gave a small nod, wiping his hands with a rag as if it were nothing extraordinary. Daniel could not resist any longer. He stepped forward. "Sir, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "How did you know what to do? Everyone else was stumped, and you just fixed it like it was nothing." The old man turned, his eyes narrowing, slightly as though measuring the young soldier. His gaze was piercing, but not unkind. After a pause, he shrugged. "You do not wrestle a machine into working," Harris said. His voice was low and rough, carrying years of cigarettes and dust. "You listen to it. It tells you where it hurts. Most folks are too busy looking for answers in manuals to hear what is right in front of them." Daniel blinked. The words sounded more like philosophy than mechanics. He nodded quickly, not trusting himself to respond. Harris handed the rag to one of the younger men and began packing away his tools. Daniel felt a pang of frustration. He had so many questions, but the mechanic's quiet presence made him hesitant. The chance came the next morning. Daniel was assigned to perimeter duty near the yard again. Harris was already at work, hunched over another vehicle, grease on his hands. The hum of activity surrounded him, but Daniel noticed that the man always seemed alone, even in the middle of a crowd. This time, Daniel forced himself to speak. Do you like working on tanks?" Harris did not look up. "Likes got nothing to do with it. They need fixing. I know how to fix them. That's all." Daniel shifted uneasily. "But you're really good at it. Better than anyone I've ever seen." That earned him a glance. Harris studied him for a long moment before returning to his work. "Kid, when you've been around these beasts as long as I have, you either learn to understand them or you stop trying." Something in the man's tone struck Daniel. It was not boastful, not dismissive, but weighted like someone speaking from experience, too heavy to put into words. For the next few days, Daniel found excuses to linger near the motor pool. Sometimes he asked small questions: what tool was best for a certain job, why the Abrams engine sounded different from the Bradley, but most of the time he just watched. Harris never said much, but every movement seemed deliberate, practiced, and oddly reverent. Daniel's fellow recruits teased him. "What's with you and the old grease monkey?" one asked, laughing. But Daniel ignored them. Something about Harris gnawed at him, a puzzle he could not let go of. And then, one evening, as the sun sank behind the dunes, Daniel finally voiced the thought that had been burning in his mind. "You work like you've been around tanks your whole life. How do you know so much, Mr. Harris?" For the first time, Harris paused completely. He set down his wrench, straightened slowly, and looked at Daniel. The mechanic's eyes were distant, shadowed by memories far away. His silence stretched long enough that Daniel feared he had offended him. Finally, Harris spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made the hair on Daniel's neck stand up. "I have been around them my whole life, son. I used to command an armored division." Daniel's breath caught. The words landed like a thunderclap. He stared at Harris, really stared, seeing for the first time not just an old man with a wrench, but someone who had once led men and machines into fire and steel. And in that moment, the outposts, the desert, even the army itself seemed to shift around him. Daniel could not shake Harris's words. "I used to command an armored division." The statement replayed in his mind over and over like a stuck record. Every time Daniel looked at the old mechanic now, he did not just see grease-stained coveralls and steady hands, he saw the ghost of a man who had once held unimaginable authority. But Harris himself seemed utterly indifferent to the effect his confession had left behind. The morning after, he was back in the motor pool, sleeves rolled up, working on a jammed turret rotation system as though nothing had been said. Daniel hovered nearby, torn between curiosity and respect. He wanted to know everything, yet feared pressing too hard might make the old man retreat into silence again. It was only after several hours of awkward hovering that Harris finally broke the tension himself. "You keep looking at me like I'm some kind of museum exhibit," he muttered, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "Spit it out, kid. What is it you're dying to ask?" Daniel hesitated, then blurted, "Why, I mean, how does someone go from commanding an armored division to this?" He gestured helplessly at the wrench in Harris's hand. Harris chuckled, though there was no humor in it. He set the wrench down on the tank's hull and leaned against the steel, crossing his arms. For a moment, his eyes seemed far away, fixed not on the outpost but on something only he could see. War has a way of stripping things down, he said finally. Command sounds glamorous until you've buried enough good men to know what it costs. When it was over, I had two choices: chase medals and parades, or disappear somewhere quiet where no one asked questions. This, he tapped the tank. Beside him was the only thing that still made sense. Daniel swallowed hard. What was it like, commanding so many tanks, so many men? Harris's jaw tightened. It was responsibility, son. Heavy, crushing responsibility. Every order I gave moved not just machines, but lives. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. He paused, then reached into the breast pocket of his coveralls. From it, he pulled a small, weathered photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded by years, but Daniel could still make out rows of soldiers standing proudly in front of a line of tanks. In the center was a younger Harris, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, his uniform sharp and decorated. With insignia, he looked nothing like the weary man before Daniel now. That was my division, Harris said quietly. Iron Wolves, they called us. We were the tip of the spear in 3 different campaigns. When we rolled, the ground shook. Daniel leaned closer, his pulse quickening. What happened to them? Harris's eyes softened, and his thumb brushed the edge of the photo. Some went home, some didn't. The ones who made it back, well, war doesn't let go of you so easily. We all carry it differently. I chose to carry it here, with machines. They don't scream, they don't bleed. The young soldier was silent, his throat tight. He had expected tales of glory, victories, medals, daring maneuvers. Instead, what he heard was resignation, a kind of weary truth that carried far more weight than any boast. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. But, you must have been a hero. Harris gave a dry laugh. Hero? No, kid. Heroes are the ones who didn't come back. I was just the poor bastard making decisions that sent them into the fire. The words cut deep. Daniel had never thought about leadership in that way. Drill instructors always talked about honor, about pride, about carrying the flag into battle. But Harris's voice carried no bravado, only the heavy knowledge of what it truly meant to lead men. Seeing the troubled look on Daniel's face, Harris sighed and slid the photo back into his pocket. You want a story, don't you? Something to put in your letters home? Fine, I'll give you one. He leaned back against the tank, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice grew steadier, almost formal, as though reciting a memory he had locked away long ago. There was a battle, Harris began. Northern Ridge. Enemy had dug in heavy on tight guns, trenches, the works. My orders were to break through so the infantry could advance. We had 30 tanks lined up, engines growling, dust in the air. I remember sitting in the command vehicle, headset on, looking down the line at all those young men waiting for my signal. His eyes grew distant again, and Daniel felt as if the desert around them was being replaced by that battlefield. I gave the order. 30 engines roared forward in unison. The ground trembled. Dust swallowed us. Within minutes, shells started falling. The man in the tank next to mine, good kid, just 19, never made it past the first volley. His tank erupted in flame. And do you know what I had to do? Harris's voice tightened. I told the others to keep moving. Couldn't stop. Couldn't look back. If one tank hesitated, the whole line would falter, and more would die. So I pushed them forward, straight into hell. Daniel's chest constricted. He could picture it, the chaos, the fire, the smell of burning steel and men. We broke through that day, Harris continued. The ridge fell. Command called it a brilliant maneuver. They pinned a medal on my chest and called me a hero. But all I could see were the burning wrecks we left behind. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voices of men I'd ordered forward. That was the last day I ever believed in medals. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the desert wind. Daniel could not meet Harris's gaze. Finally, the old man pushed off the tank and picked up his wrench again. His tone shifted back to its usual roughness. So, that's your story, kid? Now you know why I'd rather fix tanks than command them. Machines don't ask questions. And when they break, I can put them back together. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had wanted to see Harris as a legend, a larger-than-life hero. Instead, he saw something far more powerful, a man who had carried unbearable burdens, who had chosen humility over glory, and who lived each day with ghosts no one else could see. That night, as Daniel lay awake in his bunk, he thought about Harris's story. He thought about the responsibility that came with command, the price hidden behind every victory. For the first time in his young life, Daniel realized that being a soldier was not about shining boots or following orders. It was about understanding the weight of lives, the quiet strength it took to bear it, and the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent. And as the desert winds whispered through the outpost, Daniel vowed that he would learn everything he could from Harris, not just about tanks, but about the kind of man a soldier needed to become. The revelation of Harris's past did not fade from Daniel's mind. It settled there, like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew. The next morning, when he reported for duty, the outpost looked the same: sand, steel, sweat. But to Daniel, it was different. Every tank, every armored vehicle, seemed more than just machinery now. They were legacies, monuments of men who had lived and died inside them. And at the center of that legacy stood Harris. At first, Daniel kept his distance. Harris was not a man who invited questions, and Daniel feared pushing too hard would make him withdraw. But something about Harris's quiet presence pulled him back to the motor pool, day after day. When his shifts ended, when his peers lounged in the barracks or traded jokes in the mess hall, Daniel drifted back to the yard, where Harris's silhouette was always there, bent over an engine, torchlight glinting off worn metal, tools clinking. In rhythm, it was on one of these evenings that Harris finally broke the unspoken silence between them. "You just going to stand there watching, kid?" Harris said, without looking up from the engine compartment of a Bradley Dot. Daniel stiffened. "I didn't want to get in the way." "Then don't," Harris replied. "Grab a wrench. Fourth drawer, left side." Daniel blinked. For a moment, he wondered if this was a test. But he obeyed, fumbling through the toolbox until he found the wrench and handed it over. Harris accepted it with a grunt. Not like that, he said, glancing at Daniel's hesitant grip. Hold it firm. A tool's an extension of your hand. Respect it. Daniel adjusted his grip, cheeks burning. Harris gave a nod, then pointed to a bolt deep in the engine. Your turn. Tighten it. The bolt resisted, stubborn and unyielding. Daniel strained, sweat dripping down his brow. At last it gave way with a metallic groan. Harris gave a small approving grunt. Not bad, he said. You've got strength. Now you just need to learn patience. Machines don't like being forced. From that moment, Daniel was no longer just an observer. Harris began letting him help with small tasks, holding tools, tightening bolts, cleaning components. Slowly, the old man's gruff instructions grew into lessons, not just about mechanics, but about something deeper. See this gear, Harris said one night, pointing to a worn sprocket. Looks small, doesn't it? But if it fails, the whole track locks up. Same with men. Every soldier in a unit matters. Lose respect for the little guy, and the whole machine breaks. Another time, while testing hydraulics, he said, pressure keeps the system moving. Too much, it bursts. Too little, it stalls. Same goes for leadership. Push too hard, men crack. Too soft, and they lose momentum. Balance, that's the trick. Daniel listened, absorbing every word. These were not the kind of lessons written in manuals or barked by drill instructors. They were truths carved from experience, delivered by a man who carried the weight of them in his silence. Soon, Daniel began to see changes in himself. Where he had once rushed, he now slowed down, paying attention to detail. Where he had once spoken nervously, he now asked questions with purpose. His peers noticed too. You hanging out with that old grease monkey again, they teased. But when something mechanical puzzled them, it was Daniel they turned to for help. One evening, as the two of them sat beside a tank, cooling in the twilight, Daniel finally asked the question that had haunted him since Harris's revelation. Why me? You've been here longer than anyone. Why start teaching me? Harris was quiet for a long time. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his lined face. Because you listen, he said at last. Most kids your age, all they want is the sound of their own voice. You shut up long enough to hear what's being said. That's rare. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest at the words. He did not know what to say, so he simply nodded. From then on, their bond deepened. Harris began sharing fragments of his past, not stories of glory, but of survival, of mistakes, of lessons learned at a cost. There was a boy in my division, Harris recalled one night, bright-eyed, eager, just like you. He wanted to impress me so badly he took risks he shouldn't have. I warned him, but he didn't listen. One day, he exposed his tank to enemy fire trying to make a move too soon. Lost him and his crew in an instant. Harris's voice cracked, just slightly. I learned then that eagerness is as dangerous as fear. Daniel never forgot that. He carried the lesson with him on every drill, every patrol. But Harris's mentorship was not just talk. He tested Daniel constantly. One scorching afternoon, he handed Daniel a set of schematics. Tank won't fire its main gun. Show me why. Daniel pored over the diagrams, tracing the wiring with his finger, sweat dripping from his chin. After an hour, he pointed at a relay switch. Here, if it's jammed, the whole firing system locks. Harris gave a rare smile. Not bad. You're starting to think like the machine. On another day, Harris deliberately handed him the wrong tool during a repair. When Daniel pointed it out, Harris nodded approvingly. Good. A soldier can't just follow orders blindly. You've got to recognize when something's wrong even if it's coming from someone above you. Daniel began to feel a shift inside himself. He was no longer the green recruit, clinging to procedure. He was beginning to see the bigger picture, the machine, the crew, the balance of leadership. And with each passing day, Harris seemed to shed a little of the armor he wore around his past. He spoke more, laughed occasionally, even shared coffee in the mornings. For the first time, Daniel saw not just the hardened commander or the weary mechanic, but the man beneath the man who had lost much, but who still cared enough to shape the next generation. One evening, as they sat beneath the desert stars, Daniel said quietly, "I think you'd make a better teacher than a mechanic." Harris gave him a long look, then shook his head. "I'm no teacher. I'm just a man trying to make sure the next one does better than I did." Daniel smiled. "Sounds like a teacher to me." For the first time, Harris did not argue. He only looked out across the desert, where the horizon met the night, and let the silence speak for him. The desert was deceptively quiet that morning, the kind of silence that made men uneasy, as if the horizon itself were holding its breath. Daniel was on perimeter duty, scanning the sands through the shimmer of heat. His thoughts drifted, as they often did now, to Harris's words and lessons. Then, the radio crackled. The outpost commander's voice was sharp, urgent. "Enemy convoy spotted moving toward our sector. Estimated arrival within the hour. All crews to battle stations." Daniel's pulse spiked. A real engagement. Until now, he had only trained, only imagined what combat might feel like. His heart pounded against his chest as he sprinted toward the motor pool. Chaos met him there. Mechanics scrambled, soldiers shouted, tank crews rushed to their machines. Dust swirled as engines roared to life. But not all of them. One of the outposts, Critical Abrams, the one assigned to guard the southern approach, remained stubbornly silent, its crew frantically working over the controls. "She's dead." The gunner shouted. "Starters fried. We can't get her moving." The commander swore, scanning the motor pool. His eyes landed on Harris's mechanic. "Get that Abrams running now." Harris stepped forward without hesitation, toolbox in hand. But Daniel noticed something. The way Harris's jaw clenched, the flicker of something in his eyes. This was not just another repair. This was life or death. Cole Harris barked suddenly. "With me." Daniel froze. "Me." But no time for doubt. "Kid, move." They sprinted to the Abrams. Harris yanked open the engine hatch, cursing under his breath. "Starter relays shot. Damn thing won't cycle." Daniel leaned over, adrenaline surging. "Could we bypass the relay?" Harris shot him a sharp look. "Dangerous. Could fry the whole system if you get it wrong." The commander's voice cut through the din. 5 minutes. That tank must be in position, or the southern flank is exposed. Daniel's training warred with panic, but Harris's lessons echoed in his mind. Respect the machine. Listen to it. Balance under pressure. "I can do it," Daniel said, surprising even himself. "You showed me the wiring schematics last week. If we reroute power from the auxiliary, Harris's eyes searched his face. For a heartbeat, the old commander seemed to weigh not just Daniel's words, but his spirit. Finally, he thrust a bundle of wires into Daniel's hands. "Do it, and do it fast." Daniel's fingers trembled, but he forced them steady. He stripped insulation, reconnected circuits, bypassed the dead relay. Sparks crackled, the smell of burnt plastic filled the air, but he pressed on. Harris guided with short, sharp instructions, but for the first time, it was Daniel's hands that led. "Now," Harris barked. The crew inside turned the ignition. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the Abrams roared to life, its engine thundering like a waking beast. Cheers erupted from the crew. The commander shouted, "Get that tank into position." The Abrams rumbled forward, taking its place on the southern perimeter just as the first enemy vehicles crested the dunes. Daniel staggered back, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. Harris clapped a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm, steady. "You listened," Harris said, voice low but proud. "You kept your head when it mattered. That's soldiering." The battle began. Enemy technical structs mounted with heavy guns fire as they advanced. Mortar shells whistled overhead, slamming into the sand around the outpost. The defending tanks opened up, their cannons booming, sending shockwaves through the desert. Daniel had no crew assignment yet, so he stayed near. Harris in the motor pool, ready to respond if another vehicle failed. Every thunderous impact rattled his bones, but Harris remained calm, moving with quiet efficiency, directing others, checking fuel, handing out spare parts, as if orchestrating a symphony of survival. Then came the call, "Tank 2 is down, track blown, can't move." Harris snapped into motion, coal, tools. Together they rushed across open ground, shells exploding nearby, sand and shrapnel spraying the air. Daniel's fear threatened to overtake him, but Harris's calm presence anchored him. The disabled tank lay tilted, its crew huddled inside. Harris dove beneath the chassis, barking orders. Track pins sheared. "We need a replacement coal wrench, now." Daniel dropped to his knees, hands flying, tools clattering. They worked in tandem, Harris's hands moving with veteran precision, Daniel matching his pace. Above them, the battle raged, gunfire, smoke, the roar of engines. At last Harris shouted, "Track's set. Tell M to gun it." Daniel relayed the message. The tank lurched forward, grinding back into the fight. The crew saluted Harris as they passed. The old mechanic only waved them on, his face set, his eyes scanning for the next emergency. Hours later, the enemy retreated, their convoy shattered by the defenders' firepower. The outpost held. When the dust settled, when the cheers and relief spread through the soldiers, Daniel found Harris sitting on a crate, wiping grime from his hands. His face was weary, but his eyes glinted with something Daniel had never seen before. Something like peace. "You did well today, kid," Harris said. Daniel sank beside him, exhausted. "I thought I was going to mess it up." "Fear's natural," Harris replied. "What matters is you didn't let it own you. You thought, you acted, you trusted what you knew. That's all leadership is, making the hard call when no one else will." Daniel let the words sink in. Around them, soldiers celebrated. Tanks idled. The outpost buzzed with victory. But for him, the real triumph was quieter. the knowledge that Harris's lessons had not been wasted. For the first time, Daniel understood the bond between them was more than student and teacher. It was a passing of the torch from one generation of soldier to the next. And as the sun set over the desert, Daniel knew the battle had tested not only the outpost, but himself. He had come through changed, not just a recruit anymore, but a soldier in spirit. The battle's echoes lingered long after the smoke cleared. The desert smelled of fuel, scorched sand, and victory. Soldiers celebrated in small groups, slapping backs, sharing water, replaying moments of courage. The tanks stood like silent guardians, their hulking silhouettes glowing red in the evening light. But Daniel felt strangely apart from the celebration. His body ached from exertion. His uniform was blackened with soot and grease, yet inside, something deeper stirred. He kept replaying the moment the Abrams had roared back to life under his hands. The surge of adrenaline, the responsibility, the realization that Harris had trusted him in the middle of chaos. He found Harris where he always seemed to be, by a tank. The old mechanic sat on a crate, a rag in his hand, methodically wiping down tools. His movements were slow, deliberate, but his shoulders carried the same calm strength as before the fight. Daniel approached hesitantly. Everyone's at the mess hall, celebrating. Harris smirked faintly. Celebrating's for the young? I've had enough of it in my day. Out here, someone's got to make sure these beasts are ready if the enemy comes back. Daniel sat beside him, silent for a while. The twilight deepened, stars peeking out above the desert. Finally, Daniel spoke. I think I understand what you meant now, he said quietly. About responsibility. About leadership not being about glory. Today, I felt it. Even for a second, and it scared me. Harris looked at him, his eyes softer than Daniel had ever seen them. Good. Fear means you know the weight of what you're carrying. The ones who scare me are the men who feel nothing. They're the ones who send boys to die without blinking. Daniel's throat tightened. When you trusted me with that repair. Why, you could have done it yourself. You had more experience. Why risk it on me? Harris was silent for a long moment. He set down the rag, leaned forward, and clasped his scarred hands together. Because Cole, I'm not going to be here forever, he said, his voice low, steady. One day, men like me fade away, and it's your generation that takes the helm. If I'd stepped in, fixed it myself, you'd have walked away thinking, you're still just a recruit. Instead, you walked away knowing what you're capable of when the stakes are real. That's worth more than any victory. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to respond, but the words caught in his chest. Harris leaned back, gazing at the stars. You remind me of someone I once knew, bright, eager, always questioning. He was my driver in one of the toughest campaigns we fought. Scared stiff. His first time under fire. But he grew into one of the best men I ever commanded. Saved my life once, too. That's why I give you the time of day, kid. You've got the same spark. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Daniel let the words sink into him like water into dry earth. At last, Harris stood, his joints creaking. He walked to a locker at the edge of the motor pool, rummaged inside, and returned holding something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Daniel. Daniel unfolded it carefully. Inside was a weathered patch hand insignia shaped like a wolf's head. Teeth bared, stitched in faded thread. "My division's emblem," Harris said. "The Iron Wolves. I carried it on my uniform for years. Never thought I'd part with it, but you." His voice wavered slightly, though his gaze was steady. "You've earned it, not because you fought today, but because you listened. Learned, and carried yourself when it mattered." Daniel's hands trembled as he held the patch. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Harris replied. "Just carry it. Not for me, not for glory, but as a reminder. Every time you wear that uniform, remember the weight of the men beside you. Remember that machines can be fixed, but lives are not so easily mended." Daniel nodded, his eyes burning. He tucked the patch carefully into his breast pocket, feeling its weight against his heart. For a long while, they stood in silence, the desert wind brushing past them, carrying with it the echoes of battles long gone. Harris's silhouette, weathered and stooped, seemed at once small and immeasurably vast, as though he were both just a mechanic and something greater. A keeper of memories, a guardian of lessons carved in steel and fire. When the call came for lights out, Daniel turned to leave. But before he could, Harris spoke again. "Cole." Daniel turned. "You're going to be a good soldier, maybe even a leader. Don't let the uniform fool you into thinking it's about power. It's about service. Remember that, and you'll do right by the men who follow you." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't forget." That night, lying in his bunk, Daniel reached into his pocket and touched the Iron Wolves patch. He thought of Harris, of the men in the faded photograph, of the burning tanks Harris had once led through the crucible of war. He thought of the battle they had just survived, and how Harris had placed his trust in him. And for the first time, Daniel did not feel like a wide-eyed recruit fumbling his way through. He felt the stirrings of something stronger, resolve, tempered by humility, born from the lessons of a man who had carried entire divisions in his command and chosen, in the end, to pass his wisdom quietly to one young soldier. The old commander's legacy was not in medals or parades. It was in the quiet shaping of those who came after. As Daniel drifted into sleep, the desert wind whispered outside, carrying with it a promise. The torch had been passed.